Good to see you. Thank you very much indeed for coming in today. I gather that you've been to Northwood. Tell us what your trip there showed you about the UK's relationship with NATO.
No, UK is a formidable ally and in many respects a founding member of NATO, 75 years. And I think it's in the DNA of the British society and the British strategic culture to be an integral part of NATO. Maritime command, freedom of navigation, undersea critical infrastructures to protect, what we call multi-domain operations, not only land, air, or sea, but also cyber and space. Mm-hmm. So I think it's one of the most sophisticated places in NATO, and I'm very happy to see that, like always, NATO is gearing up for a very complex time in world history.
And you're happy that the UK's got the right kit for NATO's needs, that we're well prepared to meet NATO's aims?
Nobody's perfectly prepared, but that's the beauty of this alliance, that we have, I think, in our DNA, a gene for permanent adaptation to a changing environment. That's, I think, the source of our success. So what we are seeing now, we see again war in Europe, unfortunately, continuing, and this will drag on for some time. We see the South, the Middle East, very close to escalation. We see the Houthis, the Red Sea. Yep. We see the Asia Pacific becoming more complicated. So what an alliance like ours does, we adapt, and each ally, together with us in NATO, they are basically trying to invest in the best possible kit, which also means money, but also means an understanding of the environment.
Talking of money and the changing environment, David Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, has been meeting with President Trump today. Do you think Donald Trump is a reliable partner for NATO?
Lord Cameron was with us at the Foreign Ministers meeting in Brussels just a few days back, and he made there's no NATO secret here, he made an appeal to all his colleagues, the foreign ministers of NATO, to try to speak domestically to the prime ministers, treasury secretaries, but also to talk to Speaker Johnson, speaking of the package of support for Ukraine that is now under discussion in the US. And I'm very happy that he goes to see the administration, but also former President Trump. We used to work President Trump for 4 years.
Yes.
I remember vividly the meeting we had in London when Boris Johnson was the Prime Minister and President Trump was there. It was a relatively more bumpy start, but in the end, I think everyone understands in America and in Europe that NATO is an indispensable, constellation of allies.
And Trump understands that.
We are convinced that he does. Of course, democracy is democracy. We cannot prejudge the outcome of the campaign. But I know that the American establishment and American people, don't forget that almost 70% of Americans in the last survey, they believe that NATO is a great alliance. Republicans and Democrats alike, they understand that in a world that China is moving up, that China, Russia, Iran, North Korea are ganging up, you need all your allies around the world. So we know that each election has its own specific issues.
Well, you talk about
but we know that in the end everybody will understand NATO is important to everyone.
You talk about adaptation. You talk about democracies, of course, taking their own path. Does NATO have a contingency plan should President Trump, if he's elected, withdraw the US from NATO?
Listen, we have been doing this for 75 years. And we have been seeing crises in NATO, the Suez Canal, the Iraq operation, when some allies opposed, ferociously.
No one the size of the US has talked about NATO in the way that Trump has talked about NATO, the disparaging way he's talked about NATO, the initial lack of commitment to Article 5. No one's done that. Is NATO prepared to exist without America, potentially?
There is absolutely no doubt to my mind that America will continue to stay engaged in NATO, and European allies and Canada will stay engaged with the US. That's a matter of strategic reality. In a world so complicated, we need each other more than ever, and I'm convinced that in the end this will be the final conclusion of any American president.
Clearly, Lord Cameron is there to talk to Trump about aid and the aid that isn't currently being approved in Congress. Do you agree with President Zelensky that Ukraine will lose the war if it isn't approved?
99% of the support given to Ukraine, military, financial, macroeconomic or humanitarian, are coming from NATO allies and a few of our partners. So it's clear that our support is decisive. And I think President Zelensky, like always, he's trying to make the best case for his country.
Is he right, though? I mean, just realistically, I can see why he's making the case, and of course that's strong rhetoric, but is that rhetoric matched by the reality?
I think, in a way, it's against our interest as NATO and NATO allies individually not to continue to support Ukraine. Let me answer in this way. Why? Because Ukrainians, in a way, are fighting our fight. And why? Because if, God forbid, Ukraine fails to resist as an independent sovereign country, the imperial appetite of Russia to go even further Ukraine will be only encouraged. And also the example to other superpowers would also be emboldened. So we believe that it's our interest and our moral and legal obligation to help Ukraine. I know that the support will continue.
So he's right.
We know that without us will be far more difficult for them. They are a formidable force. They have a fantastic capacity to resist, but it's clear that without our support, their struggle will become more difficult.
What does winning against Russia mean for NATO?
It's what up is for the Ukrainians to decide. It's not for us to decide instead of them. I think it will be something which is against the character.
So if
of
they
NATO.
negotiate a path to peace that
they
might
will
see
decide,
the Donbass or Crimea go to Russia.
They will decide, and only them will decide when the time is ripe and under which conditions peace could be achieved. And also, let's be attentive to one thing. Russia is not to be trusted that even if they will eventually talk about peace, they will not mean peace. They will just mean a truce, rearming and eventually coming back. So that's very important for us to making sure that Ukraine gets closer to NATO, gets closer to the EU, because in the end, that's the ultimate
accepted into NATO.
That's no question to us that they will become a member of NATO. I cannot say when, but the question of if, I think, has been addressed. And I think all allies understand that one day, and we hope the sooner the better, Ukraine will become part of NATO, part of the EU.
All this rhetoric of being in a pre-war period, not a post-war period, I'll put it to you that no one in Britain is really worried about war coming here. It all feels very, very far away. What is it that those people aren't getting?
I think there is an understanding, even for the general public and even for politicians, that the definition of security these days is multifaceted. It's not just military per se. I visited Markham in Northwood.
Mm-hmm.
We have established a special unit there, a center, for protecting critical undersea infrastructure. Imagine 1 second, that the undersea cable connecting New York to London as the two financial cities, places of the world, where 90-something% of global transactions are happening every millisecond, that they will be eventually cut by one of the nations that are not our friends. What would that mean? Would mean, a massive disruption. So when we say, we cannot say it's pre-war or post-war, we know one thing, it's post-Cold War, and it's also a part of great power competition. And in Poland probably it's perceived, or the Baltic countries or Romania, differently than in London, but I think we all understand it's a dangerous world.
Maybe war's the wrong word. Maybe we're in constant conflict. Is that what we're in? We're in a world where these undersea cables or the satellites above our heads or even
cyber
or
disinformation.
We are constantly
Look at the Chinese
in conflict.
attack against the institution of democracy in your great nation of the United Kingdom. So we are basically in an era of great power competition where our security is challenged every single day in more traditional forms and in more non-traditional forms.
Across Europe, you talk about Poland, countries have been reintroducing forms of conscription. The head of the army here, the former head of MI6, former deputy prime minister, says that the UK needs to prepare for a form of conscription. Given the threats you've just talked about, do you agree?
Listen, NATO is not one size fits all. There's history, there's legacy, there's strategic culture, that's economic and democratic realities in each country. Poland has introduced a system close to the National Guard that Americans have. The Finns, our recent new allies, have a form of very interesting semi-conscription, if I can call that. Other countries are just mobilizing reservists. So it's not for us to tell which shape and form. But we say one thing. This is what we request from the UK, that we request from Finland. And if that country is fulfilling, the targets that we're establishing for each ally, we are fine with the solution adopted democratically by each of the allies.
I put that into the context of what NATO has been saying. Look at the comments of Admiral Rob Bauer, says NATO countries must prepare for a conflict with Russia. This constant drumbeat of we are in pre-war, not post-war, and yet NATO is sort of slightly ambivalent about what countries do to mobilise the population to that effort. That doesn't seem like the rhetoric is meeting reality again.
No, let me tell you like this: the best defense is deterrence. Like in football, the best defense is offense. We are now undertaking and implementing the most robust transformation of defense planning, troops, command and control, forces, structure of forces in a generation. So what we are just expecting from each ally, from the UK to Poland, from Romania to the US, is to really start implementing and execute those plans. If we do those plans, will be such an important deterrence to Russia to think of attacking an ally that this will be the most most powerful thing.
We've got a military that just about fits into Wembley Stadium. We don't have the boots on the ground that NATO might need if we're going into apparent
all of us in Europe, with a slight exception of America, probably, we all have collected what we call the dividends of peace. We have neglected defense because we believed, all of us, that we are living in a more serene world, in a sort of a post-modern world. And now we are waking up brutally to a new reality. What do? Do we give up, or we start investing again?
But does that new reality mean that people with the kind of skills a state would require if the undersea cables got cut or the satellites got took out would be needed to help the state or NATO broadly in making that work again, or in protecting that, or in advancing the interests of those?
It's work in progress. I have to say I'm personally amazed, and as NATO leaders, together with Jens Stoltenberg, to see the rapidity of adjustment of our allies to this new reality. It takes time, it takes money, it's not easy. There are lots of reflexes that probably have been a little bit, if not lost.
It takes an argument, it takes persuasion.
And
you need to persuade the public.
And we should not basically use only the argument of fear, of conflict. And by the way, also Russia is suffering a lot. They lost 350,000 troops in this war. Even if their war economy seems to be working relatively fine, the rest of the economy is suffering a lot. So the more we do the job we need to be doing to make sure that our security is protected. And I think every single citizen of this alliance in the UK or in any other country, they do understand that without peace and security, there is no business, there is no life. And this is something I believe we have to continue convincing
our
people.
People in this country about the idea of conscription brought up in many different ways, in whatever form that would take. And people go, nah, no way. I'm not standing up to fight. That's the military's job. What do you say to them?
We are just saying that societal resilience, as we call it, is important. And some countries choose conscription, others don't. I think all of us have an obligation to be ready to work with difficult situations. Yesterday it was the pandemic. Tomorrow could be, God forbid, something from climate change. The next day could be something close to a war, not a war. So I think what we have to tell our citizens is, listen, there is a more dangerous world. We are not asking things that are not acceptable to you because democracy doesn't work. But we have to understand that the world is more dangerous, and we have to be prepared as a society to withstand these challenges. And I think this is something that resonates with people.
But what does that mean? What am I meant to do? Am I meant to stockpile food? Am I meant to build a bunker? What am I meant to do?
No, but in I think in all of our countries, there is, a beginning of a, if you want, of a continuum between traditional military and non-military means. So in order to have a more resilient energy system is part of defense. If you have a smarter grid, if you have stronger cyber defenses, if you have stronger space capabilities, civilian and military, they all contribute to our security. And I think this is what our people do understand.
Have we forgotten that? Have we spent 20 years, 30 years forgetting that?
I think it was a sort of it was an illusion that history eventually never stops. There's no such thing as history. Competition among nations is part of human history. What we are now witnessing is probably the most complicated moment of transformation in human history, because you have the technological revolution, and you have also the strategic revolution. And this is something that we have, all of us, to be prepared for.
I'll put it to you finally then, that with everything going on in the world, and with the difficulties that there are presented, but what some people might see as the mismatch between a reality that doesn't seem to affect them, and the rhetoric that they hear coming from NATO, coming from politicians, is that NATO's saber rattling. NATO expanded east. NATO's been putting bases where the Russians said they didn't want bases. This is in part NATO's doing.
Listen, I'm a Romanian, and I lived half of my life in communism. And I really urge anyone else who has not lived under communism not to try it. So if a country like Poland or Romania, after years of communism and Soviet domination and gulags and everything we see still continuing in Russia, if we wanted to join the free world, is us to be blamed or Russia for trying to keep spheres of influence in Europe? 75 years ago, we just celebrated our 75th anniversary. There are only 12 allies in the West. Now there are 32. Why do you think that Sweden, for 2 centuries, neutral, 2 centuries, or Finland, neutral since the Second World War, they decided to join this great alliance? Because Russia is dangerous and unpredictable. And I think NATO is the place where you can have your safety, your security, your daily life, your concerns addressed better together than alone. So Russia, unfortunately, seems that their instincts of imperial conquest and obsession with territory acquisition and grabbing is not disappearing. What have I to do? I'm really sorry that Russia has chosen that path. But if they've chosen that path, I have the obligation to defend my people, be they from northward or from Bucharest, my city. So let's have trust in this alliance, because we are adjusting. The world is not easy, but together in NATO we are much stronger and much safer than being alone.
Great to meet you. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.